Hi, everyone. Hi. So I just want to ask if there are any announcements. I have an announcement. I just want to remind everyone that next Wednesday is not only academic fair, but all-campus mentoring day, and I hope that you will plan to attend some of the panels where we will have faculty and students talking about various fields of study here, some studying techniques, and procedures for things like independent learning contracts, or if you want to study the sciences, the humanities, graduate school. It's a really great opportunity to interface with faculty and talk about it's a way to get some advising at large, and we encourage your participation. This is a new initiative to get the campus as a whole to start having more dialogue around not only your own pathways, but sort of pedagogically what we're doing here. So the more you are active, the more vibrant that will be, and it occurs twice a year, so this will be the spring one. It's right before, it goes from 1:30 to 3 on Wednesday in the library building, and hopefully your faculty will have programs of the panels, the 2 separate sessions, so you can choose what session you want to go to. And there'll be some music and a little announcement beforehand, so please attend. We have 3, today we have Kim Miller, but we have 3 other speakers for the series. Week 8 is Stephen Hendricks here in the front row. Week 9 we have Amjad Fowler, who's, I don't know if he's here, but another faculty. And then week 10 we have Cassie Thornton coming through, who is does social practice work and writing. So please come to all those events. And then I'm going to ask Ben Haddix to introduce Kim Miller.
Okay. Is this good distance? Okay. Very happy to introduce Kim Miller. Worked with her yesterday, and it was wonderful. And worked with her today, and it was also wonderful. And tomorrow, she might be back in Milwaukee. So, great opportunity for us. Miller received her MFA at Vermont College in Vermont, and her BFA at Cooper Union in New York City. And I'm just going to read from this thing here. She has shown videos, performed live, and produced combinations of the two on national tours and in shows from China to Milwaukee. She was awarded the Künstlerhaus Buchenhausen Artist in Residence in 2008-09, the 2009 Mary L. Nohl Individual Artist Fellowship, and an artist residency at Compeung in Doi Saket, Thailand in 2011, 2012. And 2013. Miller is taught at Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok, University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design, where you are a chair and a person. So, from watching some of Kim's videos, my thoughts are that Kim's work implicates the medium. Medium in the sense of performance, body, video, place, identity, and thus medium in the sense of the artist as well. A communicator, a locator, whom we ought to trust, right? Well, I think Kim's work brings in a simultaneous mistrust towards her medium and her position as an artist, opening a space for questioning, a space to participate and to doubt. She implicates the ready-made space of technological mediation, whether that be through whether that be the screen or the microphone. What are its ethics? What are its possibilities and potentials for creating unstable subjects, for realizing a democratic subjectivity. So I hope everyone's feeling unstable today. And anyways, without further ado, Kim Miller.
Thank you, that was lovely, lovely introduction. Can you guys hear me? Yes, okay. I want to just say thank you so much to Evergreen for having me, and to Shah O'Shea in particular for inviting me here, and all of your hospitality and all of your hospitality. This place is so wild, and I'm really happy that it exists, and it seems like it's a really necessary and important thing in the world. So you guys are really engaged in this crazy experiment, and I'm impressed by how open you all seem to be to that experiment, and your willingness to plunge into the unknown. It's really inspiring. So I've learned a lot being here just in a short time. So I work primarily across video and performance, with this idea, as you heard, of interrogating a certain kind of subject, as well as exploring what it means to perform a subject. But before I get into some of my work, I wanted to just show you one of my major influences. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Adrienne Piper. There she is. This is, and in particular, I just want to address quickly her funk lessons project from 1982 to 1984. Adrienne Piper trained as a philosopher. She got her degree at Harvard, but often identifies or is identified as a conceptual artist. And in this project from 82 to 84, she traveled to mostly white universities, giving funk lessons. Funk being like a certain kind of music and dance form coming out of like R&B. And for Piper, this project was one manifestation of her idea of the indexical present, which is a big idea of hers. The indexical present is this sort of marker of a here and now, and sort of like taking inventory of what is happening in this moment. So she would host these funk lessons, invite people, give a very brief history of funk, and then start to get people to just literally do the moves. And she would do repetition with them and isolate certain movements until people started to internalize those movements. And then they would just have a free-for-all dance party. And I just want to read one quote from her on her essay Notes on Funk Lessons, where she says, "By placing the viewer in the same time frame as the object being observed, the role of the artist as a mediator between the viewer and the subject of the work is diminished, as is the ability of the viewer to place barriers in the way of an honest consideration of the subject presented." But she also just said that this project was a way to just get down and party together, and to think through moving and listen by dancing. And it was also a way to overcome the social trauma that some of us may have experienced in our middle school or high school days, of those school dances where you might have been pressed up against the wall. Inviting a social space where all could participate. And social dance in her project, not as a measure of competence or a spectator driven entertainment spectacle, but actually something to participate in, a form of community, a way of being together. So before I launch into, I'm going to show you guys a bunch of video clips today, and then have time at the end, hopefully, for questions. or responses or thoughts, and feel free to shout them out now too. I don't know how you guys do this normally. But before I go into the videos, I'm just going to show you a few stills from different projects. I should say that a lot of the work that I'm going to show you today is relatively new, and I said this earlier in Shaw's class, kind of in this vulnerable space as an artist right now, where I'm in a new place, muddling through stuff and feeling, just trying out some new things. And so some of the stuff I'm showing you guys hasn't really been seen by an audience before, so I really am actually actively courting your feedback in some ways. A lot of what I also want to show you today is work that comes out of my own collaborative practice. I don't always work collaboratively, and even when I do work collaboratively, I often still take the role of the director and kind of controller. And the work comes out of language. So even though the structures are seemingly on the verge of collapsing or falling apart, everything is scripted. I don't work well with improvisation. I need to have a structure or a script. So this is literally some of my family. We shot a video together, and actually all 4 of the adults in this picture, we received this fellowship award just by coincidence. All 4 of us got it together, and we were all friends. There was only 4 recipients, and so we decided, rather than have a 4-person show where we're each in discrete areas, we would try to merge everything. But I ended up acting as the director for everything. I still had this problem with letting go of some of the control. So this is from 2010, a still. This is from the same time, 2010. This is my friend Delora. She's an art therapist, and so I made a video or a series of videos where she is helping me work through some of my problems on camera through art therapy. Some of these are images from a show called Family Values, again, that I did with my family, and actually it was at the local public library. It was so controversial that we were asked to take it down after we put it up, which was mostly photos of family activities. So this was my daughter and her cousins sorting their Halloween candy, and we had a series of photographs of it. When I think of all the things I've done, it's funny that the only time I got kicked out of an exhibition was at the public library with my child. And then these are stills from Afternoon of a Fawn video from 2011, where I enacted a series of stills based upon Nijinsky's Afternoon of a Fawn, and I performed it with my daughter. These are images from another really wild project that I undertook as a choreographer for a group in the Midwest called the ACAP Players. It stands for the Adaptive Community Approach Program. And it's a theater troupe with differently abled adults who normally wouldn't be able to participate in performance, only act as audience. So the director of this play actually had a chip implanted in her forehead, and she had very limited mobility, but she communicated with a computer through this chip in her forehead, and the computer spoke the directions for us. And I was one of the choreographers for the performers, and it was our job to really melt into the background as much as we can and activate the performers. So it was a really interesting challenge. It was really the wildest experiment I ever was part of, and I'm really happy with it, and also now see a lot of its failures and problems. Let's see, I'm just going to pass through this. We can come back to this. I think what I'll do now is just launch into the first video clip. So, pardon me for one moment. Let's So the video I'm about to show you is from 2014. It's only 2 minutes. I'm going to just let it play and then I'll keep talking.
ลูกไปเอามาจากไหนพ่อนึกว่ามันหายไปหมดแล้วพ่อจ๋าหนูขอโทษหนูลืมความรักของพ่อไม่ได้ยังไงหนูขอโทษที่หนูทำตัวไม่ดีหนูขอโทษที่หนูหาว่าพ่อทำให้แม่ตายทั้งที่จริงมันไม่ใช่ความผิดของพ่อเลยหนูขอโทษนะจ๊ะพ่อลุกขึ้นไม่มีใครอยากให้เป็นแบบนี้พ่อเองก็ไม่อยากให้แม่ตายพ่อเองก็ต้องขอโทษลูกด้วยต่อไปนี้เราอย่าทะเลาะกันอีกเลยนะลูกแม่จะอยู่บนสวรรค์เขาจะไม่ต้องเป็นห่วงแม่จะได้มีความสุขนะลูกจ้ะพ่อ
I move across the fields of video and performance and exploring ideas around action, power, and meaning, and use forms borrowed from performance art, stand-up comedy, dance, theater, film, and ask questions around a radical democratic model, radical democracy being not that the majority rules, but that every voice counts equally. In a democracy, the majority of determines something, but a radical democracy, all voices count equally. And wondering if there is even a possible radical democratic subject. Does that really exist? What does that mean? What does that look like? What does that mean in terms of an artistic context, a political context, a social context, and how do those things overlap or slip between one another? Thinking about also how gesture informs or complicates or implicates a subject and how action differs from gesture. There's an interrogation into the artistic subject as an institution and exploring the difference between presentation and representation. And if the artistic subject is unstable, does that give credence to this idea of a radical democratic subject or not? So those are some of the things that I'm usually thinking about. This video was from 2014. Shot in Thailand. Yeah, and that's about all I'll say there. So the next series that I wanted to show you are all from 2015, and there's a trilogy. And the trilogy speaks overall to sort of this like queer feminist science fiction story, but that's really the super foregrounded structure that sometimes then slips away. So I'll experiment. The total trilogy is about 30 minutes, but I'm going to just show you some excerpts from each of them. And this is one kind of place, just with total transparency, that I'm experimenting with some new things, new processes, new relationships to form. And so I'm particularly interested in getting some of your feedback with these chunks. And I'm trying to stay mindful of the time, just to leave time at the end for discussion if we want to do that. So I'm going to play the first one, and I'll just tell you this was shot without sound, and then later a friend devised a score for the video, and he performed the score live while the video played, and the audio that you're hearing is recording from that live performance. So it's a few layers of distancing away. Okay, so that was part one. That's part one. I'll just show you a quick glimpse of parts 2 and 3. Part 2 is called Invaders of the Fifth Dimension. And there is dialogue in this piece. I'm gonna, let's see, start. I'll just show you a quick glimpse of this.
It would have to fly off or something, right?
Well, I guess maybe our eyes are playing tricks on us.
I know I saw it. I know I did.
Where's everyone going?
To look for a little star.
Ah!
Well, the doctor was acting kind of peculiar, asking about Little Star, and Dole said to stay away from Little Star.
I simply must rest.
What's that?
Oh, that's a little souvenir I meant to make off with if anyone would question my story.
Ah! What do I tell them? What happened?
Tell them to escape while they still can, before the power.
Power? What power?
Ah! I tried to save them, to make up for the vile, shameful, and infamous things I've done.
You're not so bad, really.
Bless you for those precious words. All I ask before I go to the place where no one returns is forgiveness. Malicious alien power threatening to...
And then I'll show you a glimpse of part 3. Part 3 is called part 3. And is silent, but I won't, we'll just start from the beginning, but I won't play the whole thing. So the forms used here in my work in general, like performance art, monologue, stand-up dance, those forms are all situated first in language, and again in an exploration of the formation of a subject. And as you can see, there's a separation between image, movement, text, sometimes scene, and those ruptures are intended to both like make concrete and call into question a subject. There's also obviously like a do-it-yourself approach, a fairly low production value to the work. which is intentional but also borrowing. And that low production value is sort of to counteract the spectacularness of popular culture and high production value of those kind of things, while still borrowing elements, borrowing from elements of popular culture. Strangely, I'm not sure why it's so interlaced like that. I'll just let this scene play and then I'll stop this. Okay, then they check out the experimental dance troupe. So, and I apologize, I'm reading a little bit here, but it's in my intention that a radical democratic model contains an experience enacted in a public space, in language, at the level of an aestheticized dialogue. And the work opens up a conversation between a me and a you, destabilizing this idea of a discrete subject and object, between viewer and performer, between us and them, and sort of flexing the parameters of inclusion and both engaging and eroding the position of the viewer and trying to dislodge some kind of hierarchical order, whether or not that actually happens. The address of the you of the spectator is also the address of the me. And what's at stake is one's very existence, oneself, myself and yourself, our identities, our subjecthoods, our positions in relation to one another. So through like this exploration of possible configurations, participatory or collaborative or dictatorship as director, there's a hope that you can take control of your own subjecthood in some way, and expanding upon the role of the artistic subject, there's a connection, maybe tenuous, maybe fragile, maybe artificial or naive to one's political subjectness. I want to play excerpts from two more. Well, I'll play an excerpt for one and the other one is very short. First is Madame Ne Nang Nak, which is a video I shot with a lot of people's help in northern Thailand. And it's sort of an exquisite corpse structure where people are gradually telling me a particular story about Nang Nak, who is a famous a famous ghost. So that's actually, yes, very fitting that maybe something dislodged that. There's been a lot of horror movies about Nang Nak. There's a couple that have been released here. But the video is not really about the ghost story as much as the insertion of the role of the artist or the role of the director into a community, and how the role of translation alters something, and also really just a testament to people's generosity and willingness to do something weird. So I'm going to just play a little bit of this, maybe 5 minutes or so.
Nóเรื่องผีนางนาคได้ก่อนถ้าผีจีนเนี่ยฮู้กะถ้าผีนางนาคเขาฮู้โอ้เน้นทุกคนเลยนะพร้อมเลยครับเราเป็นนะครับเราจ้างนะครับจ้างกะเอามาฮู้ขู่ครับฮะเอามาฮู้ขู่ดีกว่าครับมาเหรอเราโมโหกับมันคนเท่าอ่ะคนฮู้ดีอ่ะอันนี้เขาค เอาแบบของฮู้เนี่ยกะถ้าเอาฮู้เขาก็ไปทำฮู้คนเท่าละกันที่เขาจำได้อ่ะเมคเอาก็ได้โอเคนั่นเอา1 2 3
ไม่ว่าได้หรอ
เก็บมะนาว
ต้องมีคำถามไงอาจารย์เป็นยังไงอีกอะ
เป็นยังไงลูกเป็นแม่นาคเป็นใครลูกจะได้มาเรื่องราวเป็นยังไงมันตายยังไงมันจบยังไงอีกอ่ะ
ผมเคยขอเมื่อแล้วได้เป็นกี่ปีเลย
สรุปลองเล่าโดยสั้นๆก็ได้สั้นๆก็ได้นาที2 นาทีได้ก็ได้อาจจะใส่ความคิดเห็นใส่ใครใส่3 2 1 go
ไม่บอกว่าได้อาจารย์ไม่บอกว่าได้อาจารย์
เดี๋ยว
อาจารย์ต้อง
ไม่น่าเหมือนใครครับเนี่ยดูเชื่อผมนี่ดูไม่น่าเป็นใครไม่น่า
เป็นคนครับ
ไม่น่าเป็นคนโอเคไม่น่าเป็นคนกันเลยว่า
เป็นคนอยุธยา
กันเล่าไปเลยมันคู่เนี่ยลูกไหนมา
เขาอยู่แขวงพระโขนง
นั่นแหละกะเล่าไปเรื่อง1 2 3เล่าใหม่คนอยุธยาโอเคเล่าใหม่เลยไม่น่าเป็นคนที่ไหนอยู่แขวงพระโขนงตายยังไงครับ
ตายเพราะหัวไปทำสงครามแล้ว
Ja. Okay. Can I start? ค่ะสำหรับนางนาคนะคะในประเทศไทยเนาะก็เป็นที่รู้กันดีว่าเรื่องนี้เป็นเรื่องที่ค่อนข้างจะยาวนานมากแล้วก็หลายๆคนก็รู้จักนะคะในส่วนของนางนาคถ้าในส่วนของคนไทยจะรู้จักกันดีในส่วนของผีตัวหนึ่งที่แบบว่าแขนยาวมากเนาะถ้าในรูปนี้จะเห็นได้ว่าแบบเวลาที่เขาแสดงในละครหรือว่าที่เราเคยเห็นกันก็จะแบบแขนยาวๆแบบยื่นไปอะไรอย่างเงี้ยนะคะยื่นลงไปเก็บมะนาวใต้พื้นแล้วก็เขาจะเป็นผู้หญิงที่รักผู้ชายคนหนึ่งมากแล้วก็เหมือนกับว่าจะตามผู้ชายคนนั้นไปทุกที่ไม่ว่าเขาจะอยู่ที่ไหนก็แล้วแต่นะคะก็จะพยายามที่จะอยู่ติดตัวกับผู้ชายคนนี้ตลอดเพราะว่าเขารักผู้ชายคนนี้มากแล้วก็เป็นเรื่องราวที่ทำให้คนต่างประเทศหรือว่าคนที่มาจากประเทศอื่นรู้จักประเทศไทยในชื่อของหนังผีเรื่องหนึ่งเรื่องว่านางนาคนี่แหละค่ะ
บรรยากาศ
ถ้าเป็นได้ก็ถึงโกรธถึงต้อง
หัวไปเป็นทหารเพื่อกันนึกว่าละมันนี่กะคือมาคนเดียวเลยอ่ะ
อู้ไทยไป
ฮะ
อู้ไทยไป
โอ้โห
อู้เมืองอะไรหัวไม่เป็นทหารแล้วก็เอาเรื่องเล่าตั้งแต่ต้นจน
จบเรื่องต้นเลยกะ
มันเป็นในห้องตั้งแต่ต้น
แล้วก็คือลูกตายอ่ะลูกออกอ่ะตายทั้งกลมอ่ะนะ
แล้วได้แหม
แล้วกะยี่กะบอกไปพูดไปเตือนหลอกเจ้าบ้านกะ
ไม่ถึงว่าหลอกเจ้าบ้าน
โอ้แค้นกะมันเที่ยงเดี๋ยวพี่ตายทั้งกลมอ่ะ
แค้นนี่อย่างหรอแค้นที่เจ้าบ้าน
คือว่าผัวมันละมันกะทิ้งมันกะ
แล้วก็ไม่ก็เล่าต่อที่มือมันยาวเหรอ
โอ้หมอแต่พี่ก็ผัวมันกินยามันเอาต๊กหัว
เรามาเลี้ยวแล้วยังในต่อมันเอาต๊กหัวอย่าง
นี้มันก็เอาต๊กลงไปนะกะมือยาวอ่ะผัวมันหันเข้าใส่เราผัวมีพูดกันละโอ้กระถามมาแล้วผมเลยเล่าเลย
อะไรหัวมันหันแล้ว
จะดูกับหูกะโล่นกันที่หูแล้วกะ
แล้วหลังจาก
เดี๋ยว3 2 1
แล้วอยากให้มีคนไปพิสูจน์แล้วแม่นาคทำก็เข้าอยู่ก้มลงเห็นแม่นาคมือยาวเก็บมะนาวตกแล้วเห็นแม่นาคเก็บมะนาวมือเห็นแล้วมือยาวเขาเลยว่าเป็นแม่นาคแล้วเมื่อคืนนี้
วันหนึ่งที่แม่นาคกำลังทำกับข้าวอยู่ แล้วก็มะนาวหล่นลงไปที่พื้น แม่นาคก็ใช้มือหยิบมะนาวลงไปพ่อนาคก็เห็นพี่น้อยพูดว่าเห็นแล้วไงก็เลยเชื่อก็วิ่งหนีแล้วก็กลัวแล้วก็วิ่งไปวัดเนาะไปวัดไปหาหลวงพ่อแล้วแม่นาคโกรธแค้นก็ตามอาฆาตตามฆ่าคนที่มีส่วนรู้เห็นเอาพี่แล้วไม่รู้เรื่องแล้วไปหาต่อยังไงต่อวะพอเสร็จแล้วก็คือมีพระอาจารย์คนหนึ่ง
มีคนมาบอกมันแต่มันมาเชื่อแล้วพระน่ะมาบอกมันขนาดพระนะผีมันยังเว้นมันยังฆ่าได้หรอหยอดผีในสมัยก่อนเก่งเลยเราไปฆ่าพระเดี๋ยวบอกถ้าบ่เชื่อเนี่ยกลมแล้วหลอดวางขาพอบ้านหนูเก่าแล้วหันบ้านหนูเก่าเป็นบ้านล่าง
Project is that I'm trying to hopefully and enthusiastically work towards this idea of a democratic subject without necessarily ever arriving there. Or else when I say you, that somehow I've called you into being. So I'm going to end with just this last video. I think it's only a minute. And then if people have comments, that'd be great. Or questions. Oh no, sorry, it's 2:46. It's Hey, thanks for meeting me here. This will just take a second. Thanks for meeting me here. This will just take a second. This isn't easy for me to say. Hey, thanks for meeting me here today. This will just take a second. This isn't easy for me to say, and even harder for me to admit. It's not fair to you. Hey, thanks for meeting me here. This will just take a second. This isn't easy for me to say, and even harder for me to admit. But it's not fair to you to drag this thing out. This is my hang-up, not yours. Hey, thanks for meeting me here today. This will just take a second. This isn't easy for me to say, and even harder for me to admit. But it's not fair to you to drag this thing out. This is my hang-up, not yours. It's just that I'm not you. Does anybody have questions or comments?
like if it should or is meant for an audience?
Yeah, totally. I mean, just now when I was watching them, I was really aware of time. In all the videos, I'm thinking about time and an audience. So it's funny to think of them as being entertaining because I often think they're really boring and quiet. But I think about entertainment in the sense of trying to respect an audience's time and attention. But also humor is something that I'm really interested in and try to use. And so I think humor is part of entertainment. And sometimes try to trick people into paying more attention. And the tricking them is trying to entertain them, to get them to keep watching or listening. Does that make sense? How did it function for you?
Well, I was just wondering if, at what level it inhibits or may detract from maybe a message you're trying to get across, or if you think it enhances it.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. I don't know how to separate them.
It's like the message versus the telling of the message.
Uh-huh. Yeah, for me, I don't think I can separate them, but I think it's a good question. And in some ways, like casting them out into the world, then I don't own them anymore, so it's now your problem. It's now your experience. Which sounds like I'm trying to get out of the question, but sometimes I try to make stuff as serious as I can. That first, where there was the guitar accompaniment, I was trying to be super serious with that video. But in the end, like, this goofiness is still there, and it's something that I embrace. I don't know if this is the same as entertainment, but there's like an amateur quality to a lot of them. I work with lots of untrained actors and dancers, and with very little rehearsal time. Sometimes we rehearse, but as a strategy in some ways, a strategy of inclusion, of just making it happen, of not trying to mediate or control it too much, although there's elements that I'm always obviously controlling. So maybe that is reading as entertainment too, the amateur quality, clunkiness, this kind of do-it-yourself approach that seems goofy as opposed to like a super highly produced, slick thing. And I'm not opposed to a highly produced, slick thing, it's just not what I've been doing right now. Okay.
It's super interesting to hear you say, or refer, that you expect the audience to perceive them as, quote, boring and quiet, and also your hesitancy to consider them entertainment. So I'd be very interested to hear from you, how do you want your audience to receive your work? What do you want your work to be to your audience?
Yeah, I mean, I want it to be an instrument of consideration for them, and also there is an element, like kind of coming out of Brecht, of Bertolt Brecht, of this alienation on my part towards my audience, so trying to put some distance between what you're seeing and what you're thinking. So like trying to, by having the microphone visible, or obviously stilted line reading or kind of awkward acting, it's again not a picture onto this fantastical other world, but it's to remind you that you're also here watching something and responsible for that experience in some way. So Brecht had similar and different strategies of alienating the audience. Alienating them meaning, again, getting them to like recognize their position, that they're literally sitting and watching this thing and responsible for assembling some of the meaning and putting together the elements of what's happening. So I think back to like the resistance of entertainment, I am asking my audience to do some work. And if they don't feel like doing the work, which is totally your prerogative, it can be maybe more boring because you're just kind of waiting for it to be over. So it does ask something of the audience. And part of that is just an acknowledgement of where you are and what you're doing, but then to further consider your own subjectivity and your own relationship, not just to what you're seeing, but to your position within the world. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Cool.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, we have there. Oh.
I was wondering if you could, some of this distance that you're talking about between the work you're doing and your audience, I feel is coming from a repositioning of how judgment happens between the subject and the objects. And I was wondering if you could talk about that a little more specifically with Adrian Piper's notion of an indexical present.
Okay, so the idea of judgment between subject and object in relationship to the indexical present. And I'm just going to start talking and I have no idea what I'm going to say. But maybe just to back it up, because I'm not sure I understand judgment between subject and object. But the indexical present is literally, and Adrian Piper coined that term, but creating an index or a category or an inventory of this very moment. Me standing here, slightly sweaty, I forgot my deodorant, looking at all of you, looking at me, you know, that's a moment of indexical present. So again, coming back to some of the video and performance work, although I didn't show you any live performance stuff that I do, but trying to stay in that present moment and acknowledge not just I'm on stage, but that here are a collection of people doing something that I've asked them to do, and like in some ways using that indexical present as a way to honor their agreeing to participate and be involved. Judgment of subject and objects. I guess, can you talk a little bit about what you mean about that?
I think your last video is a really good example of the subject is like addressing the object with like by using the microphone and having it visible. Like you in the video are like making a judgment visibly as like what a video is.
Okay.
I guess is what I'm trying.
Yeah, I think that's a good, or yeah, like pointing to that, like how does a video function and how does an audience function, or am I talking to myself? Because that's, you know, video is often thought of as being self-reflexive because you're literally looking at yourself in video. So I think that's true. It's I thought of it as me interrogating or exploring the desire for audience to sort of identify with what they're looking at and just clumsily or literally trying to resist that identification. So judgment, maybe there's a presumption on my part about how audience normally functions, and then trying to get around that in some way. Does that make sense? Yeah. You had your hand too.
I was just curious as to why you chose Thailand and like the Thai language culture to be a part of your work.
Yeah. In the summers, I go to Thailand. I have taught there and lived there a few times, so it's another place to make work. The video, this last one you saw with people telling the story was made with, I didn't play the whole thing, but at the end there's the credits, was made with the help of a residency in northern Thailand. So they helped with translation. My Thai is really weak, but I can speak some, but I cannot write it at all. So in some ways it could have been anywhere, but then the selection of that story is really integral to Thai culture. Everybody in Thailand knows that the ghost story. It had a personal connection for me, the choice of that story, but Thailand is just the place that I go. And that I have connections, I have a lot of friends, and I know a lot of artists there. So over time, that's just been the thing that I do. But I mean, I think your question points to this other thing of like, what does it mean then as a white girl to be working with another culture? And I think that's a really valid question, and one that I hadn't resolved with this video, Knock Knock, but partly the way that I was trying to point to that was, again, this sort of artificial alienation where it's obvious that people are responding to something that I've asked. Sometimes you hear my voice in the background. But it's a question that often comes up with that video of like, what does it mean for you to be doing that? And I think that's a really valid question, and one that in some ways I can't really answer except on like a really personal level. Yeah, sorry.
Sort of maybe back question, connected to this idea of audience and identifying with what's going on. But I guess in the very first video you showed, with the sort of exercises in a way that people were doing with the guitar. You know?
Oh, yes.
And you mentioned Augusto Boal earlier, and sort of something that I struggle with thinking about that text is Theater of the Oppressed, is rehearsal. So if we're talking about sort of like rehearsal towards a sort of revolutionary act, or in like a broader sense, like the revolution or something, rehearsal of the revolution, being in this sort of space of theater, and theater holding that potential, then, and I don't know if you agree with that necessarily, but I think there's maybe a kind of like element of rehearsal going on, and I know you mention it in your other video, where you used Fred Hampton's speech, talking about rehearsal, and then maybe how that relates to our position right now, like sitting and observing these exercises versus participating.
Yeah. I wish, it's funny, I thought you said Theater of the Depressed, which is another theater company that someone could do, but yeah, your Theater of the Oppressed is like a social justice theater, and I don't know, in Shaw's class earlier today, lots of people seem familiar with it, but it's, Augusto Boal developed this practice, and he took it all around the world as a way to articulate oppression and to find some strategies out of it, that those strategies may never get past the theater space. And again, he would support the idea of like a productive failure. And so in that piece where you heard the acoustic guitar soundtrack, a lot of the performance were people just going through some Theater of the Oppressed activities. As a side note, I work with those guys quite a bit, and so I actually taught a class called Performing the Subject, where we did a lot of theater exercises like that. So literally they had time to rehearse them, but I think it does something really different to be the performer versus being the audience now and watching that. I don't think it's the same space, and it doesn't, like, it's an argument for actually doing rather than watching, which sometimes I say looking is doing, and you can be looking, and that's an activity. And in this case, I think the doing was the doing. And from the audience perspective, in some ways you can only access that through like an aesthetic appreciation of form, as opposed to physically forming these expressions of oppression. So in Augusto Boal's, you might like take, you and a partner or a few people might make a form that represents oppression. Not literally necessarily like someone pressing you against the wall, but like thinking more abstractly about what is oppression and what does that look like and how can you make that manifest. And then from there, moving through a series of movements that kind of take you out of this model of oppression. So, trying to think back to your question. Something about rehearsal.
Yeah, I think just, I feel like you answered part of it. Just that interaction, like, I guess I was really more interested in, like, what it means for us to watch the practice of and
Yeah, I mean, so that the three that I showed you bits of, that first one I showed you, I showed you it in its entirety, and it's only very loosely has any kind of relationship between the three pieces, except there's a lot of the same actors in all of them. That in the first piece, I had very specific movements that I wanted everyone to do. In that second excerpt where I showed you a little bit of dialogue, I had very specific dialogue. But in the first one, for instance, I had no idea who was going to show up on the day of shooting. So even though I had specific actions, I figured it could be anywhere from 2 to 15 people. And so I had to have a structure that could accommodate that. In the second piece, you saw a little of the dialogue. There was very specific dialogue that I wanted to happen, but again, I didn't necessarily have control over the actors. And in the third piece, I had a very specific plot that I wanted to advance, but I had, again, no concept of how many actors would actually show up, a problem with working with amateurs and paying them very little. So again, it had to be a structure that was flexible and could accommodate 2 people or 10 people. So they are actually literally rehearsals, especially the last one, where you saw them talking in front of the colorful wall about like its merits as an art project or not. I just filmed the rehearsal as opposed to like, all of them are rehearsals in a sense, and just filming that rehearsal, as opposed to like a polished final form.
I have a kind of question, and I wonder about this idea of rehearsal and message, both being brought up, and whether or not it's actually this, that we talked about sort of what queering means earlier, that it exists in opposition, and I'm wondering, so the role of awkwardness, right, is pretty prevalent, and the motions we go through, that there's a futility of intention, so there's this kind of existing in opposition constantly throughout. I see that throughout all of them. And so I wonder if, in fact, it has anything to do with a message or a rehearsal, and in some ways sort of inverting that and thinking more about a kind of, because what happened for me when I was watching the new video with the guitar was a kind of communal we, rather than a sense of one oppressing the other.
Right. Yeah.
So that it inverts itself in a way.
Yeah, I mean, for me, that the rehearsal, the amateur, the awkward, comes back to the idea of a hermetically sealed subject. We talked about, and I talk about queer as, for those of you that I didn't speak to this morning, and you all might have different definitions of queer, and I'd be really interested to hear about those now or later. But queer as something that exists as a negative, that not that it's bad, but that there's no positive assertion of queer, that queer is this, queer is that, but in fact queer often or always exists only in opposition to a norm or in opposition to something. So thinking about a certain kind of subject and being resistant to a clearly defined, bounded, hermetically sealed subject, but in fact that the idea of subject being messy, literally an artistic subject, but also a political subject, being messy and all over the place and not contained within these set parameters. And so that I like a rehearsal space for those very reasons, that it's not a contained go, start, stop, but that it's messy, it's casual, you can have two conversations going at the same time, and that the construction of the space is visible, and that you're still literally shaping both the space and subject. I don't know if that answers, if I'm just going off on my own tangent. So, relationship between queer and rehearsal?
Or that there's, the rehearsal is not a rehearsal for anything. It's
right.
like,
Oh, yeah.
There's an inversion of that.
Right. Yeah. This is it. This is what you get. Doesn't get any better. Yeah, because I'm not really interested. It's not that I don't see the value in that, but in these works, I'm not interested in having, again, that refined, bounded, perfectly defined final product that I want and interested and am excited about the messy, the imperfect, the awkward. And I think I'm resistant to saying the awkward is queer, but thinking about like different definitions of the subject. And maybe like trying to keep those two things a little bit removed from one another in my own mind. Yes?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of follow up because what I heard in what you were saying resonates with, Judith Butler's theorist of gender's description of gender as something, a copy for which there is no original. Mm-hmm. And so what I hear in what you're saying is that same idea that the rehearsal is not towards some product or show that's going to be put on that's going to be beautiful and flawless, but that the rehearsal is the copy. It's all copies. There is no original. There is no.
Yeah, I like that connection.
And so her thinking about what the structure of queerness is in terms of an intersection of gender and sexuality.
Yeah.
The space where that is at work.
Yeah, I really like that connection. And I have to say, I've seen this from Greg Bordowitz, who actually was at our grad program together. But his definition of sexuality, and I think he got this from Yvonne Rainer, but sexuality is the way that you just interact with the world and the way the world interacts with you. And I love that definition, taking away like sex and sexy and body parts and just like being, sexuality as just being in the world. And yeah, I'm happy that you point out the connection to Judith Butler. Thank you.
I'm curious about your motivation towards a radical democratic model where every voice counts, and then your choice of film as the medium, and say rather just like a collective performance. And there's this sort of built-in power or hierarchy with the camera, with film.
Yeah.
So how do you get around the inherent nature of the camera and then your intentions?
Yeah, I think I don't. But that's true. That in my past, I worked collaboratively with a performative troupe. We wrote and performed together. It was an all-women's troupe, and we traveled and toured. And it was all live, and there's very little video footage, and the documentation that exists is pretty terrible. And I do live stuff, which you didn't see any of today. So there's definitely a difference for me, performing for the camera and performing live. And it has to do with the author function and not me as artist not being willing to give up that author function of control, and in this case mediated through the camera. So that's a conflict within myself. Although I think in this last trilogy, I feel like I've pushed it in this way that I'm not comfortable with yet, of like working collaboratively and letting go of control in all kinds of different ways. But I'm also not willing to relinquish control as artist, if that makes sense.
I'm interested in how you include like these remnants of production, like that keep coming up, like the green screens and the microphones and that, kind of like illuminating like the process. I'm interested because this is like a really prevalent thing in contemporary art. How do you feel like people studying art or emerging as artists should approach like learning technique and learning how to really polish up their work in a more conventional manner?
I mean, so yeah, that's a great question. And I'm all over the place with my answer. I definitely think there's a real value in learning how to operate a camera, learning how to use your editing software, learning how to draw in a way that you feel control over the tool, or whatever kind of media, how to use photo, how to take a photograph. I do think there's a real value in that. And as a person that teaches in art schools, but I actually come up against that a lot because I also have this real do-it-yourself thing, and if I can't do it perfectly, I'm going to just do it half-assed rather than not do it. So I'm sort of an advocate for doing it half-assed. Like, at least then it gets out into the world in some way. But I don't think being half-assed is the goal. And I mean, part of the strategy of using like the mic, seeing the lights or the green screen is pointing back to the tools that I'm using and trying to have a critical relationship with those tools, which is different than having control over the tools, but like acknowledging that it's not by magic that you can hear my voice right now, but it's because I'm using these tools that allow my voice to be heard. And that the tools are shaping the picture, the message in some way. But I think it's a really interesting debate, and it's something actually we were talking about, Sean and I were talking about, like there's that 19th century model of the academy where people like copied old masters' paintings or like copied some marble sculpture, and they were trying to like hone their technique so that it referenced or mimicked these old masters. And then moving into the Bauhaus era of the 20th century, like creativity was the thing that was really honored, and like innovation and like thinking outside the box. These were the things that were valued. And now in the 20th century, what's a model for like an arts education, or what's a model for 21st century education in some ways? So I'm also really curious to hear what you guys would say to that. So it's something that I do think about. All right. Okay, well, thank you so much, you guys.